What if I told you there are towns in America where you can still walk down the main street, see the old buildings, and even find houses that were once full of families, but almost nobody lives there anymore? Some of these places once had hundreds or even thousands of people. They had stores, schools, hotels, banks, churches, and busy streets. People came there looking for gold, coal, silver, and a better life. Then something changed. The mine closed. The railroad moved on. A new highway bypassed the town. Jobs disappeared, and slowly, everyone left. What was left behind are some of the most forgotten places in America. And the crazy part? You've probably never even heard of most of them. So today, we're going to look at 7 hidden ghost towns across the United States that most Americans don't know about. And some of them are going to be very hard to believe were once busy towns. Number 7 is Elkhorn, Montana. High in the mountains of Montana sits a tiny settlement that looks like someone pressed pause on the 19th century. This is Elkhorn, a former silver mining town where only a handful of historic buildings remain. Unlike some ghost towns that have almost completely disappeared, Elkhorn still has 2 remarkable structures that give you an idea of what the town once looked like. They are Fraternity Hall and Gilliam Hall, both examples of the wooden architecture that was common in Montana's mining communities. Elkhorn grew because of silver. During the late 1800s, miners came into this remote part of Montana hoping the mountains would make them rich. Like many western mining towns, Elkhorn was built around an industry that could change almost overnight. When the mines were producing, businesses had customers, workers had jobs, and families had a reason to stay. But when the mining economy weakened, there was very little else to keep the community alive. People slowly moved away, leaving the buildings behind. Today, Elkhorn State Park preserves the 2 state-owned historic buildings, while much of the surrounding townsite is privately owned. What makes Elkhorn interesting is how small it feels today compared with what it represented during the mining era. There are no crowds, no modern downtown, and no busy streets. Instead, you see old wooden structures surrounded by Montana's rugged landscape. It is easy to imagine miners walking through these streets more than a century ago, heading to work, meeting friends, or spending their hard-earned money in town. Elkhorn is a reminder that a town doesn't have to become a huge city to leave a fascinating piece of history behind. Number 6 is Cisco, Utah. If you drive through eastern Utah on Interstate 70, you can pass surprisingly close to one of the state's most unusual ghost towns. Cisco began in the 1880s as a small stop connected to the railroad. Steam locomotives needed water, and Cisco became a useful place for trains and travelers to stop. As more people passed through, the settlement grew. Stores, hotels, restaurants, and other businesses appeared, while nearby ranchers and sheep herders used the town as a place to supply their operations. For a while, Cisco was much more than a railroad stop. Sheep were processed here, travelers came through, and the town developed an economy connected to transportation and the surrounding desert. Oil and natural gas discoveries later gave Cisco another reason to survive. But eventually, the things that had created the town began disappearing. Steam locomotives were replaced, transportation patterns changed, and then Interstate 70 was built in a way that bypassed the old settlement. Cisco's location, once its greatest advantage, became almost irrelevant. Today, Cisco looks like a collection of abandoned buildings scattered across a huge desert landscape. Some structures have been damaged over the years, while others have been restored or maintained by people who want to protect what remains. The town even became part of American pop culture when it appeared in the 1971 movie Vanishing Point. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Cisco is its connection to different eras of the American West. Railroad workers, ranchers, sheep herders, oil workers, travelers, and modern artists have all passed through this same place. It isn't simply a town that died. It is a town that kept changing until almost nothing was left to keep it alive. Number 5 is Ruby, Arizona. Deep in southern Arizona, not far from the Mexican border, sits Ruby, one of the more unusual ghost towns in the American Southwest. Ruby began as a mining settlement and was originally known as Montana Camp. Its history goes back to the late 19th century, but the community that people remember today grew around mining operations in the early 20th century. Ruby was not just a few cabins in the desert. At its height, it had a school, a store, a post office, homes, and other buildings that made it a real community. People came here because the surrounding mountains offered valuable minerals. Families lived in Ruby, children went to school, and workers spent their days underground or around the mines. For a remote settlement in southern Arizona, it had many of the things people expected from a normal town. But Ruby's history also includes some dark chapters. The area experienced violent events, including the Ruby murders in the early 1920s. These events became part of the town's history and added another layer to an already isolated community. Eventually, the mining industry declined, and Ruby's population disappeared. The post office closed in 1941, marking another important step in the town's decline. Today, historic buildings and mining remains give visitors a glimpse into what life looked like in a remote Arizona mining community. Ruby is especially interesting because it doesn't feel like the famous Hollywood version of an Old West ghost town. It feels more personal. There are signs of everyday life, places where people lived, worked, learned, and built families. And that is what makes abandoned towns so fascinating. You aren't just looking at old buildings. You're looking at the remains of people's ordinary lives. Number 4 is Thurmond, West Virginia. When most people hear the words ghost town, they probably imagine a dusty mining settlement somewhere in the Southwest. But one of America's most fascinating abandoned-looking towns is hidden in the Green Mountains of West Virginia. Its name is Thurmond, and its story is completely different. Thurmond was built around coal and railroads. During the first decades of the 20th century, it became a major transportation center in the New River Gorge. Coal from nearby mines passed through the town, and the railroad brought enormous amounts of business. At its peak, Thurmond was so important to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway that it generated more railroad revenue than major cities along the line. Imagine what Thurmond must have looked like during its busiest years. Passenger trains arrived regularly. Hotels and boarding houses were filled. Stores and saloons were busy. Banks handled money from the coal industry. Workers, businessmen, travelers, and miners moved through the town every day. In 1910 alone, millions of tons of coal were shipped through Thurmond, and tens of thousands of passengers passed through the station. Then the world changed. The automobile became more important. The coal industry changed. And perhaps most importantly, steam locomotives were replaced by diesel engines. Thurmond had been designed around the needs of steam trains, which required regular stops for water, coal, and maintenance. Diesel locomotives needed far less of that support. Suddenly, the railroad infrastructure that had made Thurmond wealthy was no longer as important. Businesses closed. Residents moved away. The busy streets became quiet. Today, Thurmond is remarkably well preserved, and the National Park Service protects the historic district. The old depot still stands, along with buildings that tell the story of the town's railroad and coal past. Thurmond is proof that ghost towns aren't always destroyed by a disaster. Sometimes, they simply become unnecessary. The technology changes, the industry changes, and the people follow the job somewhere else. Number 3 is St. Elmo, Colorado. Deep in the Rocky Mountains at roughly 10,000 feet above sea level, sits St. Elmo, one of Colorado's best-preserved ghost towns. And when you first see it, it can feel less like a ruin and more like a town that simply stopped moving. Wooden storefronts line the road. Old houses remain standing. The mountains rise around the settlement, making it easy to understand why people came here and why it was so difficult to stay. St. Elmo was originally known as Forest City and was incorporated under the name St. Elmo in 1880. The town grew because of gold and silver mining in the surrounding mountains. During its busiest period, thousands of people were connected to the community and the mines around it. There were hotels, stores, saloons, restaurants, a post office, a school, and other businesses needed to support a growing mining town. For a short time, St. Elmo had everything a growing western town needed. But mining towns lived by one simple rule: if the minerals stopped paying, the town stopped growing. As mining declined and transportation changed, people began leaving. Railroad service eventually ended, and the local economy could no longer support the population it once had. the town slowly became quieter. Yet St. Elmo survived in a way many other ghost towns did not. A large number of historic buildings remained standing. The Library of Congress documentation describes the town as an important physical record of a typical late 19th century Rocky Mountain mining community, with much of its early wooden architecture surviving. That is what makes St. Elmo special. You don't need to imagine the entire town from a few foundations. Much of the town is still right in front of you. And despite the word ghost in its name, St. Elmo isn't interesting because it is haunted. It is interesting because it shows what happens when a busy mountain town loses the industry that created it. The buildings stayed. The people didn't. Number 2 is Garnet, Montana. Now we head back to Montana, where an old mining town is hidden in the mountains east of Missoula. This is Garnet, and compared with many other ghost towns, it is surprisingly well preserved. Garnet grew during Montana's gold mining boom in the 1890s. At its peak, around 1,000 people called this remote mountain settlement home. Miners came looking for gold, while other people came to run stores, provide services, and support the growing population. But Garnet had a problem that almost every mining town eventually faced. The gold became harder to find. As the mines became less profitable, workers left. Businesses lost customers. The town began to shrink. A fire also destroyed many buildings, making the decline even worse. By the 20th century, Garnet had become largely abandoned. And yet, Garnet didn't completely disappear. Today, the Bureau of Land Management manages the site and has preserved many of the remaining buildings. The town offers a rare chance to see what a 19th century mining settlement actually looked like. There are old structures, historic streets, and a visitor center explaining the people and industries that once existed here. The journey to Garnet also helps explain why the town was able to survive in such a preserved condition. It sits in a remote mountain setting away from major modern development. Even today, some roads leading to the site are steep, narrow, or rough, and winter access can require snowshoes, skis, or snowmobiles. Number 1 is Rhyolite, Nevada. And finally, we come to a ghost town that might be one of the clearest examples of how quickly an American boomtown could rise and disappear. Rhyolite, Nevada, was born from the mining rush of the early 1900s. In 1904, prospectors discovered gold in the area, and almost immediately, people began arriving. What started as a mining camp grew into a surprisingly large town. And this wasn't a tiny settlement. Rhyolite had hotels, stores, schools, banks, restaurants, electricity, a hospital, an opera house, and even a stock exchange. The National Park Service says the town reached somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people during its boom years. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of people came into one of the harshest desert environments in America because they believed they had found the next great mining city. Buildings went up quickly. Money flowed into town. Businesses opened their doors. The railroad arrived. People made plans for the future. But the future never arrived. The financial panic of 1907 badly damaged Rhyolite. Mines began closing. Banks failed. Businesses disappeared. The town's population fell rapidly. By 1910, only about 611 residents remained, and in 1911 the Montgomery Shoshone mine and mill shut down. By 1916, the town's electricity was finally turned off. A town that had once looked like it was going to become a major city had collapsed in only a few years. Today, Rhyolite is famous for its ruins. Parts of the old bank remain. The jail survives. The historic train depot still stands, and one of the strangest structures is the bottle house, built from thousands of glass bottles. What makes Rhyolite so powerful isn't simply that it is abandoned. It is the speed of the story. People arrived believing they were building a permanent future. They constructed expensive buildings, brought electricity into the desert, opened businesses, and created a community from almost nothing. Then the gold economy failed, and the people disappeared. Today, the desert surrounds the ruins, just as it surrounded the original town. But now there are no crowds, no busy stores, and no trains bringing new workers. Only pieces of the old city remain. And that brings us to the real reason these 7 places are so fascinating. Ghost towns are not really stories about empty buildings. They are stories about people. So the next time you drive across America and see an old road disappearing into the mountains or desert, remember, there may be an entire forgotten town waiting somewhere beyond it. A town that most people drive past without ever knowing it existed.